That's good. Okay, hello and good evening to everyone today. Today I'm speaking to Tony Hiller from realclimatescience.com, the guy with the cute dogs, who who's got a lot of sarcasm regarding climate change, and him and I are going to try and make sense of the new religion. So, Tony, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Hugo. It's good to be here.
Yeah. I guess I'll ask you this. How did you get into the whole climate story? Because my understanding is you're a geologist and you're an electrical engineer.
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in weather ever since I was a little kid. And I was working as a geologist at Los Alamos National Labs around 1980, and my boss introduced me to the idea of global warming. He was a chemist, and it all sounded pretty plausible. And I was pretty much of a true believer for decades. It, and it went so far as at one point when we were having a bad drought in Colorado in the about 20 years ago, they shut down the soccer fields because they were very dry and they were afraid the soccer fields were going to get damaged. And I went to the Longmont City Council and told them, look, with this global warming going on, it's just going to get worse. So our kids need to they need to play soccer. They have kids in Brazil play in the street, and they're very good players. They rarely get to play on the very nice lush green fields, which American children do.
Right.
And they would learn to be better players if they could play on these hard fields. And the city council bought off on my argument, and I actually believed it. I mean, I was coaching soccer and I wanted to get the kids out on the field. So I might have been a little bit manipulative, but I actually believed what I was saying. Um, but a couple of years later, I started seeing changes. It started getting a lot wetter and cooler in Colorado and other places I was visiting, like England. And and I started asking questions and started looking at the data in the same way I would do as an engineer. And
Right.
what I found was that what they were doing was atrocious. They weren't doing science. It became obvious to me within a few weeks that they were just pushing an agenda. It was quite commonly government climate scientists were making claims which were the exact opposite of what the actual data showed. And I realized this was a consistent pattern.
But did you confront the government scientists about this?
Yeah, at that time I did, and it was possible to do that. 14 years ago, it was possible to do that. You could get a response. But at this point, the people who tell the truth about climate are completely censored. They're blocked from any communication with the academic community that's involved in this fraud. The press won't allow um, climate realists any voice. The conversation website, which is supposed to enable conversation, completely blocked any conversation with anyone with a different point of view about climate a couple of years ago, which is
and
pretty.
that should make anyone skeptical, if
Yeah,
just to begin with. I mean,
yeah, it's ridiculous. They call themselves the conversation, but their specialty is preventing conversation. So
okay.
but at this point, it's gotten much worse. We're just bombarded with completely fake, made up stories about climate from the press, day in and day out, hundreds of them every day. And it's all a huge effort to demonize fossil fuels. It doesn't actually have anything to do with climate or science, it's an agenda to get fossil fuels shut down.
So I wouldn't get to just a bit on the agenda before we get to the data tampering, which is actually what this conversation is about. But on the agenda, I mean, I've worked for energy sectors. I've worked in nuclear. I've worked in actually in offshore wind, and I've worked in oil and gas. Um, Nobody in the energy sector believes that decarbonization is possible. If you ask the engineers or the people that seriously thought about it, but they are willing to go along with it, because have you figured out why it is that fossil fuel companies are so ashamed of their own product?
Well, I don't think they're ashamed of it, but like Upton Sinclair, the playwright, said, It's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. People who
Right.
go up against this climate cabal, they get their lives ruined, they get their careers ruined, they get their funding cut off, they get viciously attacked, and there's very few people who are willing to stand up to it. I've lost quite a few jobs as an engineer when the company found out that I was a climate skeptic, and my jobs have nothing to do with climate. I'm an electrical engineer. So,
So they actually went after you.
oh yeah, yeah. Um,
Wow, that's insane.
be,
Because I must be careful because the other day, I mean, I work for a company in the energy sector, and they had like a decarbonization talk, sort of like announcing the plan. And it's now, sort of companies these days have safety as our number one priority, and now climate is like our number one. So, the two interchange all the time, and diversity is another one.
right.
It's the part of the religion. And anyway, so I asked the guy there, and just a very normal question: don't you think we're going a bit excessively overboard with this? And that question has never occurred with them. It's like I asked the heretic question. I didn't deny anything or go into the details. I just said, look, you're trying to replace methane stoves with electrical stoves, for example. I don't know why we're doing that. We're trying to put solar panels all over, but the core business of the company I work for is in fossil fuels, and it's in Africa where they need fossil fuels, right? So I just made this claim to them, and their response was they cannot understand why anyone would question their intentions.
Yeah, John Kerry was in Africa a few days ago, and he said that they have to cut back on their carbon emissions, even though Africa produces less than 4% of global emissions.
Yeah.
And he told them not to use natural gas, which was pretty incredible because one of the primary causes of death in Africa is women cooking with dung and wood
Yeah.
indoors and breathing in all this air pollution, and then they die early. And it's the fact that they don't have access to natural gas, like
Or coal for that matter. And this is the argument I make with Americans that debate me on this, or Europeans, is that I think you can cut childhood pneumonia deaths in half if you move from deforestation, which is the primary fuel in Africa, just to coal, before we even get to natural gas. So clearly, even the bad fossil fuel, the one that's been demonized, is better than the alternative. And I mean, there are other just practical aspects to this, which is that natural gas has the major advantage that it can go over long distances. It's dispatchable. That's an enormous advantage in a country like Africa where there's no navigable rivers on a
yeah.
continent. So it's just things like that. It just deviates from the discussion because everything is like a religious obsession with climate change, and I just don't get it.
Yeah, someone sent me a link to a Google search in Germany for firewood. It's they're having a huge demand for firewood in Germany right now, which is going to create a lot of pollution this winter because they know they're not going to have enough gas and electricity to keep people warm. So people are protecting themselves by burning very dirty fuels, which because their government shut down their clean fuels. It's crazy.
Well, let them go through a winter of discontent, and maybe they change their minds. Because we've seen now in the last year how I think the Italian government came to a fall, the UK government changed, the Estonia has changed power, and Macron even lost the absolute majority in the French Parliament. And nobody says it, but behind all of this is price of energy. And
Yeah,
we know, so the narrative of the politicians is changing. I mean, the UK is now allowing fracking,
yeah.
overnight.
Yeah, reality hitting now. Yeah, there's an amazing story out of California this week. Their largest natural gas power plant was at Moss Landing along the Coast Highway. It was there for many years. I used to drive by it all the time when I lived in California, and it put out zero pollution. It's burning natural gas, which doesn't pollute. And they shut it down. The California government shut it down a few years ago and replaced it with this giant lithium battery thing, which is the largest in the world. Well, it was Elon Musk thing, Tesla batteries.
Well, as a
Okay,
South African, I do apologize that he is BSing
yeah,
the US public. He figured out how to play Mr. Science Whiz to the US politicians, and
yeah,
it's hilarious what he's
yeah,
getting
but
away with.
yeah, but so anyway, so this huge thing, this huge battery installation caught on fire the other day, and it's burning. It shut down Highway 1 in California. It's spewing out, toxic fumes. The residents of Moss Landing have been forced to shelter in place. The traffic shut down on the highway, and they had this beautiful, clean, burning, reliable natural gas power plant, which they shut down and replaced with a toxic waste dump, which is not producing any electricity. Well, never produces any electricity, but
And
it's,
that is not bad for the environment, right?
yeah, it's horrible, and it's making the people there are probably going to suffer severe health effects in the future as a result of this. The whole thing's completely insane. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, insane. I want to give you so to dig into the global. So I put a title here as the global mean temperature
Oh
anomaly.
yeah.
Now, many of us, when we hear this, the average temperature of the Earth is going up. I mean, can you explain to us how they get it? Because I assume they don't have a thermometer somewhere that just says this is this is the temperature, like they take a temperature when you're sick of the Earth.
Yeah, if you're cooking a turkey or something, you just stick a meat thermometer into it, and it tells you what the temperature is. But with the Earth, it's a little bit more complicated than that. They want you to believe that they have this tremendous network of thermometers all over the world, reliable thermometers, and they've had it for a long time. And what they do is they just average out these thermometers all over the Earth, and they show that the Earth has warmed a lot over the last century. But nothing could be further from the truth. And the other thing which you said in your email to me was that they claim that they're actually adjusting temperatures down rather than adjusting
Yeah,
temperatures upwards. And once again, this is a completely fake story. It's like I was at they had a big mineral show in Denver last week with vendors from all over the world. It's I think it's the second largest mineral show in the world. And there's one vendor I particularly like from India. They have fantastic stuff, and they always have a sign up, everything 50% off. They have it from the first day of the show. So
right,
what they do is at the front end they double the price of everything. The prices they put down are double their price they want to sell it for, and then they just put up another sign, everything 50% off, to make people feel like they're getting a good deal, so they want to buy it. So
right.
they're not actually marking anything down. It's just that they loaded everything up at the front end and then mark it down at the back
Well,
end.
there was a store in South Africa, a very famous shopping chain called Checkers, like a Walmart equivalent. And every week they used to have a special where they would mark something else off 20%, and that was to try and get people like to be recurring customers. And every week some people would follow it, think that everything's on special when it wasn't.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a standard marketing ploy. If you drive out on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, you stop at a jewelry stand. It's always everything's 40% off, 50% off, 60% off. People have been doing this forever, and these government scientists are doing the same thing. They make up fake data at the front end, and then they mark it down at the back end and say, "Look, we're actually cooling the temperatures." But the data they started with was fake, so
Mhm.
it's pretty meaningless.
So I want to give you an opportunity to put some slides together for us to sort of just guide us through what is happening with the temperature record.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm going to sort of share the screen here and then let you do a
Okay.
bit of the talking.
Yep. Can you see it now?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the official temperature map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, showing where they have daily temperature data from the years 1891 to 1920.
And just my first notice there is South America and Africa seems to be quite absent in the data.
Yeah, there's essentially none. There's some in Buenos Aires, which is one of the worst urban heat islands in the world. So that which completely skews the data from South America, and there's almost none in Africa, as I'm going to show you.
So you're saying to me the entire South America, or a great part of it, is represented by Buenos Aires, and I
Well,
assume Cape Town represents Africa,
yeah, but as you can see, they don't actually have long-term data from Cape Town either. Uh,
right?
so the vast majority of the high-quality data in the world is from the United States. The United States has excellent temperature records going back to the late 19th century, very coherent, and not many other places on Earth do. Some parts of Europe, like Germany, have very good high quality records. Other parts of Western Europe have fairly decent records. Japan has good records, and Eastern Australia has some
Right.
pretty decent records too. Not that many stations, but enough to. But for the most part, Russia, Asia, India, Africa, South America, Greenland, Antarctica, they have almost no data. And
Okay, so when they tell me, because we had one of our professors at Witwatersrand University saying that South Africa is 2 degrees warmer than it was in 1900, how the hell does he know anything of that?
yeah, well, this I just want to make sure it's clear that this is what I'm showing you is daily temperature data.
Right.
They have other lower quality data sets, which they call monthly temperatures, which who knows where they came from. You can't measure temperatures by month. What you do is you measure temperatures at a specific point in time. And normally what they
Mm,
do is they measure the low temperature in the morning and the high temperature in the afternoon. So no one really knows. You can't verify where a monthly temperature came from without the daily temperatures, and those aren't generally available. So the data set, the global data coverage is atrocious, and that's the most important thing to realize. So
right.
they make these very detailed graphs showing, temperatures increasing with temperatures at the University of East Anglia in England. They show temperatures from 1850 to within a hundredth of a degree. What are they talking about? They probably have an
And what was the resolution on the older thermometers?
the thermometers themselves were fine.
Okay.
We've had accurate thermometers for hundreds of years, but it's the lack of data that's the problem.
Okay.
So the University of East Anglia probably has an error bar of 2 or 3 degrees, but they're reporting temperatures to a hundredth of a degree, which is just an atrocious engineering mistake, as you know, being an engineer.
Mm,
But they do it, and the press and politicians just blindly accept their horrible data practices. So let's
yeah.
move on to the next slide. So as I said, most of the data, the vast majority of good data is from the United States. This is what the NASA official NASA U.S. temperature graph from 1999. You can see that they showed 1934 was the warmest year. 1998 was more than half a degree Celsius cooler, and there was a strong cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. Now I'm
So
going to
that is mean temperatures from the data you just showed us previously. That's the mean for the
right.
US, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the average
And
of
that's unadjusted data, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, it's the average
Yeah.
of daytime and nighttime temperatures. Now I'm going to show you the same NASA temperature graph from 20 years later in 2019. They massively cooled 1934. They made 1998 warmer than 1934, and they created a warming trend where there used to be a cooling trend. So you can see there's a huge amount of data tampering going on to create the appearance of a warming trend, which doesn't actually exist in the data. It's
But
propaganda, it's not
just
science.
just again, what is the difference between when was the first graph published?
This was 1999.
Okay.
This is you can find this on the NASA website. It's still there, or at least it was last time I checked.
Right.
And then this was the same graph from 2019. And I've cut off after 1999 because I wanted to do an apples to apples comparison of the
Right.
same years. So the data is being massively tampered with, and this is this is where most of the good temperature data is from, is the United States, and they're tampering with it to create a fake warming trend. So this gives us a pretty strong hint that what we're dealing with is fakery. It's not science.
So
But
your critique against the global warming hypothesis is it's not even a conceptual problem or climate sensitivity or any of that thing. It's just you're saying the data just is fraudulent.
it's fraudulent, yeah. And if you look at the it's other proxy information like the behavior of glaciers. Glaciers were melting very quickly in the first half of the 20th century. And then they stopped doing that for many years. In the second half of the 20th century, it got much colder. And then there was some glacial melting going on from the late 1970s until about 15 years ago, and then it's largely shut down again. Glaciers are not really melting, and the North Pole, the Arctic sea ice isn't really melting anymore. But we don't hear any of this information. So it's very clear that from the proxy record of things like glaciers, that the global temperature record, which they keep showing us, is fake. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here and just show you a little bit more from the United States before I go to the global temperature record.
Mm.
This is the official temperature data from the United States National Climate Assessment, showing that heat waves in the United States were much worse in the past than they are now. Prior to 60 years ago, the US had much worse heat waves, and over the past 60 years, heat waves have been much milder. Once again, this is the exact opposite of the story which we're constantly being fed to by the press.
But I think even the IPCC admits this very, very subtly inside the reports that they say they cannot give any indication that extremes have increased, and they say it will be in the future because the projections are there.
Yeah, and the reason they can't give any indication is because there's no evidence. The evidence shows the opposite, that generally we've been living in a fairly mild climate period in recent decades. That in the past we've had horrifically bad weather, and we're very fortunate that we don't live in those times anymore.
Okay, fair enough. So basically, this trend tells me 1930s. Okay, 1930s was the Dust Bowl in America.
Right.
There was bad heat waves in South Africa. My grandfather used to tell me how they slaughtered the lambs because there wasn't enough water for the animals. Australia, I remember stories about that. And Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine from Stalin, was partially influenced by global drought, right?
The 1930s, there was a terrible drought around the world. 1934, the drought was pretty much everywhere in the world. In 1921, there was a terrible global drought, which killed millions of people in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia. In 1896, there was a horrible drought which killed um, 20 million people in China, about that many in India, millions of people in Brazil. In 1878, there was a similar drought to those. So we've had horrific droughts and heat waves in the past, which are erased. They've been removed from the temperature record.
Mm. And it's the reason people are dying less from them. Okay, obviously there's fewer heat waves, given that graph you just showed there. But I mean, the other reason would just be we are better at farming these days. We're better at air conditioning, things of that sort.
Yeah, and we have air conditioning available for a lot of people. Another reason is that the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is making crops grow much faster than they did in the past.
That's heresy. You're not allowed to say that.
Yeah, crop yields have greatly increased over the last 60 years.
Right.
And if you go back 100 years, Scientific American wrote an article about this in 1920, saying that they demonstrated how you could get a huge increase in crop yields by piping in carbon dioxide from industrial facilities to agricultural facilities. And in 1921, a famous German scientist said that the lack of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was the leading worst problem facing humanity, because it was limiting the amount of crops we could grow.
So if we followed the science back then, we would
Yeah,
have pumped CO2 in the atmosphere.
yeah, we had actual science 100 years ago discussing energy and carbon dioxide, and now it's all been replaced with this climate superstition,
Right.
which it has nothing to do with science. So here's another graph
Mm.
from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration showing that hot temperatures were much more common in the United States back in the 1930s than they are now. So, but I was just looking. I'm going to make a video this morning about another propaganda piece about record heat waves in the United States this summer, which is completely false. This past summer was, as far as heat waves go, was not much above average and much cooler than the very hot years of the 1930s.
Right. And that's measured in what unit? Intensity or number of days or
Yeah, this is the number of days over 35 degrees Celsius,
okay. Yeah.
and the average number of days at all the stations. So in 1936, there were the average number of days over 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit was 36. whereas in recent years it's been less than 15. The past decade, past 5 years has had some of it's had probably the least extreme hot weather of any 5 year period in U.S. history. So the whole the whole story is completely fake, but it's pushed
Mm.
constantly by the mainstream media.
And the lack of critical thinking is just astonishing. I mean, you look at that graph and you're like, okay, where's the CO2? You know, like,
Yeah, the trend is the opposite of
yeah,
what the CO2 is doing. And there's good reason why heat waves are down. And it's that we're growing a lot more corn in the United States than we used to. But the corn yields are up about over the last 60 years are up about 500%. Corn emits lots of water vapor into the atmosphere, which increases the dew point. That keeps daytime temperatures down and keeps nighttime temperatures up. So,
right,
so what they use is they use these increased nighttime temperatures as evidence that carbon dioxide is overheating the United States, and we're all going to die. When in fact, the real story is that we just increased the dew point by growing more food.
right.
It has nothing to do with carbon dioxide at all, other than the fact that the carbon dioxide is making the corn grow faster. So, um, so yeah, so you think so now I'm going to show you the actual adjustments that are done to U.S. summer temperatures. The pink line is the measured U.S. summer temperatures, which were much hotter during the 1930s. But what NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, does is they massively cool the past and they warm the present. So they create this warming trend by just with tampering with the data. That's all that it's
But
not a
when you say tampering with the data, so I want clarity on that. What do you mean they do? They actually just change the values, or there's
yes,
there's an algorithm or something?
yeah, they change the values. They claim they're doing it for a good reason. They say people didn't know how to measure temperatures in the past, and they were
Yeah,
measuring
but
them. Yeah,
so what is the rationale then? What, like when you say they didn't know how to measure it? I mean, I'm trying to like look at their defense.
yeah. One of their favorite things is they said use this time of observation bias adjustment. Um, if you reset your what they use, people always use these min max thermometers, which will record the highest temperature during the day and the lowest temperature during the day, and they would reset it. They reset it once per day, and the claim was that they reset it. And many people were resetting their thermometers in the afternoon, which created a warming bias. And there's a sound theoretical basis to that. If you reset your thermometer at the wrong time, if you reset it in the afternoon, you're going to tend to double count warm days. And if you reset it in the morning, you're going to tend to double count cold days.
Right.
But if I've done analysis of this, and the amount of the actual effect is much smaller than they're using, and it only accounts for the very small portion of the adjustments.
And how do they know, like at the individual station, somebody double counted in the 1900s or 1950s? I mean,
Well,
it's a bit of thumbs up, you know.
the United States, like I said, has very good station records, and the operators would report what time of day they were taking
Okay.
taking their measurements at. But the vast majority of this is just making up data, and the way that this works is that for some reason, NOAA's been losing a huge amount of stations over the last 40 years. The amount of stations they've got now is down about more than one third from 40 years ago. But they continue to report temperatures for the stations which don't actually exist. And they have a
What?
yes, they have 1,281 stations, which they report temperatures for every month, but only 800 of them actually report every month. So,
So wait, so you say 400 stations, if I understand you correctly, is basically computer generated data,
yeah, it's fake. They're just
right?
generated from it.
Because they're
And
not
that's
even trying.
Yeah, and that's where most of this adjustment comes from, is just from fake data. And they don't admit this, but it's very clearly their raw temperature data is publicly available, and I've created a bunch of tools where people can access it and look at it for themselves. They can generate this graph themselves using my tools.
Right.
But Yeah, but it's fake. It's manipulation. They're pushing their anti-fossil fuels agenda, and making up fake data is a big part of that. So this graph shows the amount of adjustments that are being done in the United States. United States summer temperatures. In 1921, they adjusted temperatures down more, almost to more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And now they're adjusting temperatures up about zero point 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So they've created about 2 degrees of fake warming through data tampering. And this warming doesn't actually exist. The actual temperatures show, this is for mean temperatures, show no warming. For afternoon temperatures, there's actually been a strong cooling in the United
So
States.
I mean, you can make some argument that based on the that if you go back to the two graphs that are
Yeah,
measured and
yeah, sorry.
adjusted, you can make some argument on the measured data that perhaps there's some slight warming from what's it 1940 onwards. But I mean, you have to explain first what happened in the past because that's before there was CO2.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, this warming we've seen recently is probably due to increased corn yields.
Right.
This is the average temperature of day and night. Have- Summer nighttime temperatures in the United States have increased by a tremendous amount over the last 60 years, and it shows almost a perfect correlation with the increase in corn yields. So I think there's very strong evidence that it's due to the corn pumping out water vapor and increasing dew points, which keeps temperatures from cooling at
Mm.
night.
And there's that much corn in the US to influence the data set?
Oh yeah, the whole eastern half of the United States, there's corn growing everywhere. If you look
Mm.
on like Google Earth, you can see cornfields everywhere from Nebraska into the to the Appalachian Mountains. And there's quite a bit of corn east of the Appalachians as well. So yeah, and you can see if you fly over the United States in summer, it's hard to see the ground because there's so much humidity in the air, which is being generated by this corn. There's this constant haze, and which wasn't there when I was a kid. I used to fly back in
Right.
the 1960s. I'd fly across the United States. You could see the ground much more clearly. But now, if you fly over the United States during the summer, unless a cold front just came through, you can hardly see anything because of this humidity haze. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
so yeah. Okay. So basically, I mean, if your graphs are this integrity in what you're saying here with the measured adjustment, you're just basically telling me that this entire narrative is fabricated at best. There's nothing to worry
Yeah,
about.
it is. Yeah, now I'm going to show you, I'm going to come back to this later, but I want to show you what NOAA does in Africa. Okay, this animation flashes back and forth between two NOAA graphs. One shows what they report to the public, and the other one shows where they actually have thermometer data. So if you look right here inside the circle, you can see these gray areas. This means they didn't have any actual data during June of
Mm.
2021 in Central Africa, right? But they're reporting all-time record temperatures there without any actual data.
Wait, and
So
that is in the DRC where they've had a civil war for a very long time, and I mean that's where
right,
there's no data. So, and where there's massive human rights abuses and stuff. So, you know,
yeah, yeah. So NOAA's creating what they say record warmest temperatures with no data. So once again, they're simply making data up, and they're doing this all over the world. You see, look at this area. Western Australia was very cool in June of 2021, but they're showing no temperature anomaly there. So they've erased the cool temperatures in Western Australia. They're doing that. They did the same thing in Russia. It was cold in Russia, and they erased it. They made it white, which means it was average temperatures. So if you look at this map closely, they did the same thing in a lot of South America. So they're just making up fake data all over the world. It's not just the United States problem. They're doing the same thing um, in
but
many
but but
parts
but
of.
I mean the scientists get paid to do this. So I mean, surely they must believe in the data, or like
Why do you think that?
well, I mean, if you give me a job like this to do, I mean, at least I must have some kind of conviction that I'm predicting the past correctly, or it's something of that sort. Otherwise, you're just a shill. You know.
So, yeah, I was working with some climate scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research a few years ago. And I talked to them about that. And I said, I don't think that the data really supports this global warming narrative. And they said, well, even if it doesn't, we're still doing the right thing because of ocean
Ah,
acidification. So what they do is which isn't a real thing either, but they've justified in their mind that it's okay for them to not be honest about this because it's the right thing to do for humanity anyway.
it's the noble lie type of
Yeah,
theory.
right.
Okay.
So I don't think I don't think any serious scientist actually believes this, but there's huge amounts of money and the
Mm,
reputations and careers at stake. So they go along with it. Okay, so this was the satellite temperature map from that same month, June of 2021. You can see that no place in Africa was hot. Parts of Africa were well below normal temperatures, and like I said, Congo temperatures were average there,
right.
but NOAA was showing it as record hot, so it's
But because
completely
I mean
fake.
the reason why I would even pivot to that graph,
Yeah,
even if they had measurement stations, is this. I mean, if you have a heat flux, you'd expect it to go to the poles and not to the tropics,
yeah,
and that's what we basically seeing. On that graph there is that the northern poles is, I mean, a little bit warmer, and the
yeah.
equator stays the same because there's no heat there. It diffuses from there.
Yeah, and Antarctica has been having record cold the last two winters, which has
Ah,
been spilling up into Australia and South Africa and parts of South America. Australia's having one of their best ski seasons ever this year. It started very early. It's still going now. They still got tons of snow on the
but,
ground.
but but I was reading a report the other day, a newspaper article. It says global warming can increase the amount of snow. You know. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's a good story. Except for the fact that it's been very cold in
right.
Australia as well. So that story doesn't work. What's happening is they're getting all this cold air streaming up from Antarctica, and which has been dumping snow, and plus they're getting moisture from the La Nina coming across the Pacific. So they get cold air meeting wet air from the Pacific, and they've gotten huge amounts of snow at their ski areas, and they're still getting it. They're probably going to be skiing in Australia for a few more weeks at least, which is
Okay.
pretty remarkable. Okay, so now here's another temperature graph. This was the government view of the world in 1974. This is from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1974. World is getting cooler, and they showed that there was a tremendous cooling trend from the 1940s through the 1960s, and that 1970 was actually cooler than 1870. This is very different from the current temperature graphs, which I'm going to try to find now. Okay, so this is the current official temperature graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Now they show, a tremendous amount of warming, and I'm going to show you some details of how this data has been faked.
Yeah, because that is the fact checkers put that graph or something similar, saying that's where you're wrong usually.
Yeah, right. They say this is official. It's good. Look, it's got an official government seal on it, and the government wouldn't lie. Everyone knows the government wouldn't lie,
No,
right?
I mean, of course not.
And the government's completely competent. The same people who shut down
The
all
same
the
people who
energy.
lie, the same people who lie us into wars would not lie to us about this.
Yeah, right. And they shut same people who shut down all the energy in Germany and are forcing people to buy firewood are so they create this graph, right? So now I'm going to show you a newspaper article from 1989. This is quoting Tom Carl, who is head of climate analysis at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for decades until 2017, when Donald Trump became president. He quickly resigned because he didn't want to get called before Congress to answer questions about the data tampering.
Right?
But anyway, in 1989, he said he was a climate skeptic in 1989, and he said, while global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. So he said that most of the warming occurred before 1921, right?
All right.
But if you look at this graph from the same agency now from 1921 to 1979, they show a lot of warming. But in 1989, they said that that time period had cooled. So once again, you can see that they've altered the temperature data, and that's become critical for this fake temperature graph, which they're showing now, to convince people that we're destroying the climate and we're all going to burn up because of the burning of fossil fuels. So this graph is fake. The whole thing's fake. They're using fake data to generate it. And I'm going to show you some more fakery. So this was from the New York Times. Unfortunately, it's partially or hide. I guess I can hide this. Okay, can you still see my screen?
So I'm looking at this more nowadays as a crime scene than it is actually a failure of scientific inquiry.
Oh yeah, there's nothing. This is nothing to do with science. It's a massive fraud that's being perpetrated on the public
Yeah.
by people who want to control the energy supply.
Mm.
Um,
So
so, but
I'm still seeing the New York Times Thursday. That's your screen there.
okay, all right. So this is New York Times publishes in 1978. Data from the southern hemisphere, particularly south of latitude 30 south, are so meager that reliable conclusions are not possible. This was a report from German, Japanese, and American specialists who was in the British journal Nature. Um, so once again, this is what we were looking at before. Their data just doesn't exist in the southern hemisphere. And now look at this one, this next one. Okay, this is from Phil Jones, head of climate analysis for Britain. He said, for much of the southern hemisphere between 40 and 60 south, the temperature normals are mostly made up because they don't actually have any data there. So this was a ClimateGate email. So they were openly communicating with each other. They were fabricating data.
But I just watched a video that said there's a conspiracy theory about ClimateGate. You know.
Oh, conspiracy, yeah.
So you're telling me they actually conspired to tamper with the data? Okay.
Yeah, they're doing all of this right on me. Everything I've shown you is official government stuff. I'm not
Right.
showing you my stuff. Every single thing we've looked at is official government data. And newspaper articles from the New York Times, and so this is not a conspiracy theory. This is quite being done quite open out in the public, but people don't want to believe that they're where's that? Where's that seal? People want to believe that their government is telling them the truth, right? It's got that seal on it. It makes
Right.
people feel it's scary to believe that their government is lying to them. So people tend to prefer to just accept the lies rather than acknowledge the uncomfortable position that their government is not telling them the truth.
But I mean, you speak now about this lying. I mean, it's sort of like a bogey for an entire industry, right? I mean, so if this dye would become exposed, and I guess even exposing it doesn't really stop the industry anymore. It means all this investments, all this stuff that follows from it just has to go away in a certain sense.
Yeah, in 2009, Lawrence Solomon wrote in the Financial Post, Canadian Financial Post, that global warming is now the world's largest industry. So there's just huge amounts of
Yeah.
people in many different sectors profiting from keeping this global warming thing going.
But I had a conversation with a guy on Twitter today, and he's like, "Yeah, but the Koch brothers are funding climate change deniers." So I have to ask you, have you ever gotten money from the Koch brothers?
I'm still waiting for my first check.
Okay.
I'm hoping it'll come one of these days, Hugo, but it's not coming. And the reality is that the amount of money which climate skeptics get every year is a few $1 million, perhaps, compared to the tens of billions which is going to the other side. And if you're going
Yeah.
to make the argument that money corrupts science and that a few $1 million of oil money is corrupting the science, why don't they acknowledge the fact that the tens of billions going into climate alarmism is corrupting science much worse than the oil
But
money
but but,
could
but
be?
that is the argument, and this is one thing that frustrates me, especially when I talk to people who are more on the political left side of the spectrum. And I say to them, look, when it comes to the Iraq War, I'm in agreement with Noam Chomsky. You know, when it comes to Middle Eastern foreign policy, all of that stuff, military-industrial complex, I'm completely in agreement with the political left, right? But when it comes to climate change, they have just like stopped all the critical thinking that they give to foreign policy and to the government usually, and they've fallen in line and made it their own religion.
Well, yeah, but I think using labels like the political left, you have to be careful of them. Joe
Yeah.
Biden has, he first thing he did was start shutting down fossil fuels as soon as he took office, and this has led to the first, it led to a conflict with Russia. It's leading Europe to war.
Yeah.
It's a direct result of Joe Biden's energy policies. So to believe that the left is against war and against, creating wars for energy, I think is just not
There's
true. They're
yeah.
doing this intentionally to provoke war.
Yeah, they wanted the war with Russia. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just I mean, and the idea. I mean, our prime minister, not prime minister, minister of I think finance here in France was on TV saying he's going to destroy Russia by sanctioning its oil. Okay, and so okay, fine. Now we don't have oil. How does that destroy Russia?
yeah. But Russia's just selling their oil to China and India now,
The
and
Chinese are
it's
selling it back to Europe.
yeah,
Great stuff.
right, right. The people who are getting hurt are the people in Europe and people in the United
Yeah,
States,
yeah.
not the people in Russia. They're by driving oil prices up, they're making huge amounts of money for Russia.
Mm.
They're making their sales, like you said, they're just laundering the oil through China now. So yeah, so they're doing that. I've I talked about this as soon as Biden became president. That what they're trying to do by shutting down U.S. energy is bring back the wars. Trump shut down the wars for 4 years. This made the military-industrial complex very unhappy. And I should to make a disclaimer here that I actually work for the military-industrial complex. they, they
Right.
they provide part of my income right now. I'm working for a defense contractor. And I've worked for many defense contractors. There's lots of money in it. There's lots of work available. I'm doing
Yeah.
very
Well,
interesting.
I
I'm
have to
doing
put
very
the
interesting work,
I
but
have to put
it's
the disclaimer at the moment. I'm working for the European Union on wind farms,
yeah.
offshore wind. So I might lose my job after this podcast.
but but yeah, it was obvious to me all along that this whole thing, that Joe Biden shutting down the energy, the purpose of it was to provoke war and bring money into the military-industrial complex, which
Right.
I am benefiting from myself, and many other Americans are as well.
Okay. So you're a whistleblower as well. That's
No,
great.
not a whistle, not a whistleblower. Just I'm just a guy observing data that this is all fakery. So,
Yeah, that's fair.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess I mean I don't know if you have anything else to present to us, but I guess this is about the story itself. So you're basically making the argument that the entire debate about global warming, what the mechanism is, whether it's water vapor, whether it's climate sensitivity, all of that stuff is sort of irrelevant if the data you have, doesn't have integrity.
Yeah, it's all fake news. There's no indication that humans have had any significant impact on the climate. There's no theoretical basis for believing that humans could have a significant impact on the
Mm.
climate.
No,
Short of nuclear winter, we could probably do that. And the way we're headed, we may well end up creating that with the
well,
insane.
I'm even skeptical of the fears of radiation. I don't believe radiation is as dangerous as people think it is. But I don't want to try nuclear war either to prove myself wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So let's find out. What do you? Can you ask you this thing? I mean, there's also a bunch of climate skeptics who don't want to open this part of the debate up. They debate mechanisms and they debate climate sensitivity and things of that sort. Like, have you approached them with this, and what has their response been?
Well, yeah. So I've been calling this a scam for at least a decade, quite openly, and I've been lots of climate skeptics have been very angry at me about that. Say, so don't call this a scam. We just need to win the scientific debate. And to me, it was obvious there was never any science going on here. This was never about science. Um, it was about pushing an energy agenda. And it's been sort of amusing to me to watch these climate skeptics keep trying to argue the science as if at some point the other side's going to listen to them and say, okay, you're right.
Mm.
You're right.
It's
We're going to,
it's similar to the guys with COVID.
yeah,
I'm one of the few people, not few people, one of the people who believe that COVID was just rebranding of existing diseases. And I can prove it to you using the data because there's no evidence to believe there's a new pathogen. But as soon as you say that, like even those who are skeptical of lockdown and, who call for the Great Barrington Declaration and Sweden and all those things, they look at you like, "What do you mean? Are you denying everything?" And I'm saying, "Yes, I don't think there's anything in the data to tell me there was ever reason to do anything. It's all just BS from beginning to end."
Well,
And
let me tell you my personal story about that. I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and the governor of Colorado announced that he was going to shut the state down the next day. So I grabbed the dogs, got in the car, drove to Nebraska, spent a few weeks filming sandhill cranes. Then I came back, and on my way back, I stopped in Cheyenne, Wyoming, found a place to live. I've been living there ever in Wyoming ever since. So when Wyoming, we had no lockdowns. We didn't really have any variation from our normal routine at all. And but across the border, 10 miles away in Colorado, they have these horrible lockdowns and mask mandates and everything. And if you look at the death rate, COVID death rate in Colorado and Wyoming, it's almost exactly the same. They did
yeah,
all of these claimed mitigation measures and did no better than us in Wyoming, where we did nothing. You know, it's pretty 10 miles away. So it's pretty
but
clear
but
to me
my
that,
view is,
yeah,
if there was a deadly pandemic, you'd see bodies around you. You know, if this was the Spanish flu or the Black Death or any of these things, and we just don't see that. You know,
A-
so
and that's what we saw. That's how they started this. They showed pictures of people in Wuhan lying on the ground dead wearing their masks, right? And that was the story. That's how they scared people. Oh my
yeah.
God, you're just going to be walking down the street wearing your mask and you're going to drop dead. And I thought those pictures amused me because apparently the masks didn't work. They weren't protecting the person
No,
because they were dead. Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing, it doesn't add up. But okay, just to get back on the climate stuff. So
Yeah.
you've been making these videos now for how long is it? 10, 14 years, I think.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I must say, it's quite humorous. I like the videos, like my weekly climate update. I watch one of your videos just to make sure that my mind is still sane. Are you
Yeah.
are you, are you still planning on doing these things in the future?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I made one at like one last night about this idiocy with his exploding batteries in California shutting down. I'm going to make one, but later this morning about the latest fake news about this. The press is Yahoo News is claiming that we had this incredibly extreme hot weather, full of extreme weather in the United States, when in fact we had just slightly above average temperatures. Forest fires in the United States over the last 2 months have been near a record low. We haven't had any hurricanes, tornadoes. We're well below average. The parts of New Mexico, parts of the West, which they claim we're experiencing a mega drought, like Arizona and New Mexico, actually had near record rainfall this summer. And
So,
they
so, so
just keep
what,
persisting with the same lies. Yeah.
but what is it going to take for the elites? Because this is always the interesting thing to me when you take opinion polls across the West, across Africa, for what it's worth. The political elites are dead scared of climate, right?
Yeah.
But the average ordinary person, it doesn't even occur to them, the question. It's just like, we've got other problems, right? So what is it going to take to convince these guys who are scared that this is just the weather, you know?
Well, the key is communication, and that's in education, but that's why they've shut down. The conversation doesn't allow climate skeptics, why the public schools or
Right.
people are being fed all this massive propaganda going back to 2006, when essentially every public school child in the world was shown Al Gore's science fiction movie.
Yeah,
So,
I was also shown Al Gore's movie, and it was quite painful to watch. I remember as a child watching it, I'm like, this guy is such a fake.
yeah,
Yeah, you could just see the fakeness. I mean, I didn't understand any of this stuff, but
yeah.
you just see this is a bullshitter. you know?
He's now Al Gore's now the Telegraph, UK Telegraph, says that Al Gore is now a billionaire.
Oh
He's made
yeah,
huge amounts of money off of this. He sold his climate television network, his green television network, to some oil producing state in the Middle East, and he made like
but
$300 million off of
but
it.
but, but this is what I don't get. They accuse you, a guy in what's it in Wyoming or or Colorado, accuse you of being funded by the Koch brothers. When you're doing your real climates, I can see from your website, like, look, this is not a billionaire, right?
Yeah,
But despite the content being good, they accuse you of being a Koch brother funded guy. But Al Gore, he just gets a free pass.
yeah,
Obama gets a free pass.
yeah. Yeah, there was a great 60 Minutes episode about 10 years ago, which had Richard Branson and Al Gore on it. And the 60 Minutes interviewer asked Richard Branson if Al Gore was a climate prophet. And Branson got a big smile on his face. He says, "Well, I guess it depends on how you spell prophet." And then they all broke out laughing. They know
Yeah,
they're quite open about it. They were quite open with the fact that this is about money. It's not about climate.
yeah, and this is the other thing that I mean, the other ones that scare me is the bankers that are on this now. These I don't know if you know who Mark Carney is. The I think it's the former head of Goldman Sachs, and he's
Yeah,
proposing this. Well, he's basically behind the ESG movement. It's sort of his brain idea. And I mean, the billions, if not trillions of dollars that is being pumped into the scrap, it's astonishing. And it's just like it flies over the head of any critical journalist.
yeah. Well, except for Lawrence Solomon, who in 2009 said the global warming industry is the largest industry in the world, and
Yeah.
I think he's correct.
Okay. But do you have an idea of how one would get out of this trap? Because here's a big issue I'm seeing coming, a big conflict. Um, India and China still has to develop. Okay, China is relatively developed, but it still has a population almost the size of America that has to live out of poverty. And by the end of this century, I think 4 out of 10 people in the world will be African because Africa's population is increasing faster than the rest of the world.
Right.
So, Africa currently produces 0.15% of the world's CO2, I think it is. Some people say 3%, but whatever, it's very low. There's no way to lift people into the middle class without increasing their CO2 emissions, right?
Yeah.
So you can obviously see the new colonial geopolitical argument that's coming in conflict. And it'll be interesting to see how the United States is going to try and contain the anger that's going to brew up in Africa, because
Yeah. Well, like John Kerry was there this week telling Africans not to use natural gas, which would help the population tremendously. So yeah, they're taking a huge risk. But if you look back at United Nations and U.S. government policy for 50 or 60 years, it's been very clear that a lot of what they were doing was intended to reduce the African population. In 1969, the United Nations had a conference where they were actually discussing putting sterility drugs in the food and water supply shipped to Africa. There was an
and
article.
I don't get why they believe Africa is overpopulated because the square area we're the least populated in the world.
It's probably just racism. Would be my just fundamental racism.
Yeah, it's part of it, and it's also I mean it's part of the U.S. liberal, not just U.S. The sort of like a liberal idea of wanting to help the native. There's that little stereotype that is real. John Kerry presents it. He's going to fly to Africa in his greenhouse spewing private jet, and he's going to tell the poor Africans how they must develop their own energy system. You
Right.
know that level of paternalism, and that, by the way, John Kerry is not very popular in Africa at the moment. He doesn't
I
know
can,
it, but
I can imagine that's the case. Yeah. There was this great story last week in the United States with the Florida governor flew a bunch of undocumented immigrants from South Central America to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, where Barack Obama has his 70-acre, $20 million home with eight,
beachfront home,
eight,
right?
yeah, with 8 bathrooms. And he flew 50 immigrants. Or Barack Obama's house could have easily housed all of these people in great style. But the people of Martha's Vineyard became very angry. They all have these signs up in their yards about we're a sanctuary city. We welcome immigrants. Everyone's welcome here. But as soon as the immigrants actually arrived, they became very angry and called in the National Guard to have them deported. And then they started making these great statements after they got rid of them, saying, "Wow, our 48 hours with these immigrants greatly enriched us."
Yeah,
That's why we called it the National Guard, to get them removed.
but anyway, that was a brilliant move by DeSantis.
Yeah, yeah.
Must say. So, anyways, Tony, yeah, I'd like to thank you for giving us a little bit of light on this issue. And yeah, as I say, people need to follow, I guess, real climate science. And just the last question: what's the story with your dogs? Why are they in your videos?
Well, okay. So in the Wizard of Oz, right? We've got this fake wizard who's terrorizing everyone who lives in Oz and terrorizing Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Lion. And little Toto, the little dog Toto, who looks like one of my dogs, runs over, grabs the curtain, and slides it back, and shows that there isn't any wizard. It's just some guy with a machine. So Toto pulled back the curtain on junk
Ah,
science on this agenda in 1939 movie. So that's what this is about. I always say I'm pulling back. Toto's been pulling back the curtain, and it's referring to that scene where the little dog exposed the junk science, and he's still doing it now. Right.
okay, that's great. So, well, thank you very much for exposing the junk science and for entertaining us. I think that's more important. And yeah, please continue doing it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hugo.